welcome back to another episode. Today we are talking about codependency. And codependency has been something that has been used quite a bit in popular mental health literature as well as clinical literature for quite a while. And so we're going to start with just talking about what codependency is, how it's defined, as well as what happens to that definition when we use a trauma informed lens. So, first of all, Lena, what's codependency?
Well, before we get into that, can I ask you where you first heard the term codependency?
Yes, I think I first heard it when we were at Hazleton. So, when I was getting sober, for the listeners, I was getting sober at a facility called Hazleton in Minnesota. And I think it was like the third week, my family came out and we did some family work. And we did a lot of group therapy, but I'm pretty sure it was at Hazleton that I first was aware of that.
That's what I remember as well is hearing it first at Hazelden. And it's interesting because the definition actually came out of the AA movement and was noted to have been used as early as the mid 1950s. And so codependency started out as a way of describing enabling behavior with an addict and somebody that would um, make sure that no bad or harmful consequences came to the drinker or the alcoholic as a result of their addiction. And then in the 90s, it started being used more broadly. And in today's vernacular, it's being used as any relationship in which there's an imbalance between two people and where one person tends to be more of the taker and the other person tends to be more of the giver. So that's kind of the evolution of the definition of codependency.
Oh, that's super interesting. I didn't realize it went back so far to the 50s.
Yes.
Okay, so it was a product of Bill W. and friends.
Yes.
Okay, so here's my question for those who are listening and may not um, understand what enabling is. Can we just really quick talk about what enabling is?
Sure. Enabling is when we have somebody that we love, that we're in relationship with, that we care about, who engages in destructive behavior. And instead of allowing them consequences from the destructive behavior, we jump in and try to remove the consequences. So if you had a father or mother who was alcoholic or an addict, it would mean that you as a child would call in sick to work for your parent because they were passed out and you couldn't wake them up so they could go to work. Now it can be applied to any imbalance in a relationship in terms of is somebody in the relationship required to jump through hoops or walk on eggshells to make the relationship work and to help the addict or the person with the problematic behavior not have to suffer consequences from those choices.
Okay, thank you. So, you and I have talked about this privately about what are some of the challenges of the current definition of codependency that you see?
What I see is one of the biggest challenges is that it's not seen through a trauma informed lens. And one of the things that I've been saying for a couple of years is there's no such thing as codependency. It's just a trauma reaction, et cetera, et cetera. But when I was thinking about it this morning, I realized that the term may still be helpful in describing certain behaviors and in describing a certain style of engaging with another person. But if we don't include the trauma informed lens on it, then we're not taking into account the drive that we all have for connection and the fear we have of not being loved or of being rejected or abandoned. And those behaviors that we've termed as codependent actually can come out of mirror neurons in which we reflect internally what we're seeing in another person. And this happens subconsciously. And when that does happen, we start to experience what the person in front of us is experiencing. This can then trigger our autonomic nervous system, and we go into a set of behaviors that's designed to enhance our safety in the relationship. And so if we're afraid that somebody will abandon us, and with addiction, that's really common because when you're an addict, your primary relationship is with your substance of choice. And so if I am engaging with an addict and I have mirror neurons that trigger my autonomic nervous system, then the trauma comes up in subconscious form, and I start engaging in behaviors that are designed to prevent that person from leaving me, giving up on me, rejecting me. And so my drive for safety bumps up against my drive for connection. And that's where it gets a little difficult and dysfunctional, maybe. But I even hate saying the word dysfunctional in this, because our drive for connection and our drive for safety are not dysfunctional. It's just that when they get triggered at the same time, we can engage in behaviors that are reflective of a trauma.
So I think that is a really, really excellent explanation. And it is a little high level. So I just want to break it down a little bit for some of the listeners who may not know a couple things. First of all, one of the things I know from my work with you is that we have two drives as humans, two critical drives at all time: the drive for connection and the drive for safety. And those are biological, inherent drives that, because we're pro social mammals and we are primed for safety or,
Right.
looking for safety. So those two extremely inherent drives are constantly kind of mitigating and like balancing one another, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then when let's talk about mirror neurons a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
because that's like a whole new concept that blew my mind when I found out about it. So you're saying, if I'm understanding your explanation, you're saying that the way we have previously used codependency is problematic because it does not include a trauma informed lens. And a trauma informed lens includes looking at how someone's drive for connection and drive for safety affects all of their behaviors
Within relationships.
within relationships. Okay. Okay. So, knowing that, you are proposing that a new definition of codependency would be wider. It might include a set of behaviors, as you said, that could still be used to describe someone's behaviors. But now, if we broaden the definition of codependency, we're really saying there is a biological reason for these set of behaviors, and it comes from a place of an unhealed trauma.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes, because of the drive for safety and the drive for connection. And what I find really problematic is how um, it may have started before the 90s, but I know in the 90s, it was very common in the self improvement field and the arena to see codependency as pathological. And I have a really big concern with that, because if you don't understand how trauma impacts the way we engage with each other, then you're calling something pathological that's actually a biological imperative. It's just that the signals get mixed up. And when we are trying to prevent disconnection, our nervous system will engage in all sorts of behavior, or prompt us to engage in all sorts of behavior designed to maintain a connection with somebody who oftentimes isn't able to connect. But we have no idea of this because we don't realize that when we're engaging with someone with problematic behavior or someone who has either behavioral or substance addictions, we honestly don't realize that their capacity to connect is severely limited. And because we are driving for connection, but we are also driving for safety, we jump through hoops, we walk on eggshells, we make excuses, we give more than we are getting in the relationship. And when we start to think that there's something wrong with us because of this, and that I have a problem because I engage in this behavior, we are completely ignoring the idea that it all comes out of trauma.
That is such a great and helpful, I think, call to action for clinicians to look beyond the typical definition. And it's also such a great understanding for people who are going through this or who have been called codependent that, we have both types of listeners for our podcast. And so I'm aware that if there's a coach or a clinician or a therapist to look beyond um, that smaller definition of codependency and try not to pathologize that. And if you are a listener because you're interested in helping yourself, then it goes back to what you say to me all the time, and that is everything you've ever done, every behavior you've ever engaged in has been either for survival or connection and has got you to this point and you have survived. Now
Right.
that you know better, you can make choices to change your behavior and deal with what the underlying cause is. But I just want to let our listeners know once again something that you tell me all the time is if you have codependent tendencies, just consider it could be a trauma response. And it most likely is.
And
Um,
Amy, oh, excuse me.
Go ahead.
I was thinking about some of the other things that we talk about frequently. And um, one of the things that we talk a lot about in doing this work is the concept of self-compassion. And if you pathologize your own behavior, that's a drive for connection, then it's really hard to be in a place of self-compassion. And so instead of being curious and understanding where it may come from a past trauma or from problems with how we attach in our younger years, we see it as a fault. And so then it becomes, I have a problem that needs to be solved instead of something or some things have happened to me that I need to address. And those things have led to certain behavior patterns that are not serving me any longer.
That's great. Normally, we have a tip that we give people on each episode, and I'm wondering what would be a appropriate tip we can give them for looking at codependency or codependent patterns.
It might drive people crazy, but I'm really, really um, strongly insistent that just noticing without judgment becomes its own intervention. And as we notice our behavior without judging it, we can become curious about what the intention of the behavior is. If we think about the idea that our behaviors in relationships are coming with good intentions, even if they may be perceived as maladaptive, then when we notice ourselves engaging in certain behaviors and we think to ourselves, okay, well, let me think about this. I'm just going to be curious. I'm noticing that I'm engaging in people pleasing behavior. And let me think about how that might be connected to either my drive for connection or my drive for safety. And as we do that, we're exercising benevolent curiosity that we've talked about before. So instead of I'm bad, I'm wrong, it's more I'm really curious about how I ended up in this pattern or why I'm engaging in this type of behavior right now, not because I need to fix myself, but because I want to learn how to move on from this.
I think that's wonderful. I would also add I am a huge fan of journaling.
Right.
And a lot of times when I'm thinking through an issue, it's difficult for me to make heads or tails of it, even when I'm trying to be self aware. And so, if it is something that helps, I would encourage our listeners to journal about it and notice what comes up. These are all clues for us
Right.
of where to go in our healing journey. So,
Sure. It's all information. And then the other thing that just occurred to me as you were talking, Amy, is that most of us have been impacted by alcoholism or addiction. And the 12 steps are a beautiful way of extracting ourselves from the dynamic that becomes created in situations where either somebody we love was raised by an alcoholic or an addict, or when we have been impacted because somebody that has been close to us over our lives has also been impacted by addiction. And looking into the concept of the 12 steps, and instead of being frightened away from the 12 steps, taking a look at it from a place of benevolent curiosity and thinking about how engaging in a different pattern of behavior can free us.
thank you. Well, thank you so much for another great episode. And we look forward to being back next week.
Take care.